is it, Madam Speaker, that the House of Commons is green? The answer is that the first commoners met in the fields. They were overwhelmingly farmers who harvested a living from the fields of England. They were overwhelmingly taxed, though, by a greedy crown that took out of their pocket and out of their hands the bread that they had earned. As a result, they imposed upon King John in 1215 the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which required a whole series of restrictions on the power of the crown. Most important of these, among the most important, was the crown could not tax what the commoners had not approved. And thus began the tradition that only the House of Commons can pass a bill to raise spending or taxes, and only the House of Commons has power of the purse. That principle remains in place today. I have the rule book, O'Brien and Bosk, which you follow in your chair as you administer this chamber. And it says the Constitution Act of 1867 provided that any bill appropriating any part of the public revenue or imposing a tax or duty must originate in the House of Commons with the commoners. It follows that the same principle be that if the Commons votes to remove a tax, that tax must be removed. This House of Commons has voted for a common sense conservative bill, C-234, to take the carbon tax off the farmers that feed us. Yes, you can applaud that. Applaud them, applaud the farmers. The farmers that feed us, of course, need energy to do so, and therefore they need the ability to power their drying machines, to transport their grains, to heat and cool their barns for their animals, all of which requires energy. The more tax the government imposes on that energy, the more expensive it is for them to produce the food that we eat. And thus we have the misery and poverty that has resulted today in the same way as it always has whenever the Crown, or in this case the state and the Prime Minister, take too much. And we see what's happened. The government is rich and the people are poor. After 8 years of this Prime Minister and his NDP government, there's record food bank use. This week we learned that under NDP policies imposed through this Prime Minister, we had 800,000 people in Ontario alone visit 6 million times to a food bank. This is a record-smashing number. Nationwide, 2 million Canadians going to a food bank. This is a 32% increase from when the Prime Minister took office. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, housing costs have doubled, the rent has doubled, mortgage payments have doubled, down payments have doubled. Tent cities have formed in every major city in this country. In Halifax, in the province of the federal housing minister, there are now 30 homeless encampments in Halifax, one city. We never had this before this Prime Minister. What is his response? He divides to distract. He turns Canadian against Canadian. He gives out taxpayer-funded opioids to medicate people out of their misery. Later, next year, he intends to bring in medical assistance in dying for the mentally ill, so that people who are living with the total misery and isolation that his economy has created can have their lives ended altogether. We couldn't even have imagined that life would be this hellish for our people 8 years ago, Madam Speaker. And what is his solution now? He wants to quadruple the carbon tax. He wants to raise it to 61 cents a litre on gas and diesel. Obviously, this will make it unaffordable for people to drive to work and heat their homes. But then there are the indirect costs. Because when you tax the energy of the farmer who makes the food and the trucker who ships the food, you tax all who buy the food. Let me give you an example. In my riding, we have Carleton mushrooms. They supply mushrooms across the Ottawa, Carleton region and into Western Quebec. They're now spending $150,000 a year on carbon taxes. $150,000 a year. And now the Prime Minister wants to quadruple that tax. So we can presume that their tax bill would go up to $600,000 a year for one farm. How is that farm supposed to feed people? Well, the answer is it will become mathematically impossible to do so, because as the member for Foothills will tell you, as I'm splitting my time with him, we will see more of our food produced by foreign farmers in countries with poorer environmental standards. This is the famous story of Suntech Tomatoes, another great farm in my riding where the Prime Minister taxes the CO2 they release into their greenhouse, even though it's absorbed by the plant life. Apparently he missed that day in science class. But the problem is that it's now more expensive to buy a Manotick tomato in Manotick than a Mexican tomato. And therefore the price signal the Prime Minister and the NDP send to the Manotick consumer is to buy the tomato that had to be trucked and trained across North America, burning fossil fuels from a less environmentally responsible country to feed foreign food to our people. This policy of quadrupling the tax on our farmers will mean more expensive food for consumers and more foreign food that sends our money, our jobs, and our future out of this country at the same time as sending more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We would be better to repatriate the food production to Canada. We have the 6th biggest supply of arable land per capita in the world. We shouldn't have to import any food. But here we are, more dependent on the rest of the world because the Prime Minister punishes the very farmers who try to feed us every day. And this tax compounds again and again and again. It's a tax that doesn't apply once, like, for example, the sales tax. It applies sometimes on a single product. It can apply 20 or 30 times. It applies, for example, when the farmer buys the fertilizer. Well, that fertilizer has already been carbon taxed. And then he has to bring the seeds to his field. Well, the transportation of those seeds has to be carbon taxed. And then when the harvest comes out and he brings it in from the field, he has to be carbon taxed to dry those grains. And then if he's presumably feeding those grains to his livestock, they might be in a barn. So that barn has to be heated during the winter. Yep. And so the barn is carbon taxed. And then when those, let's say that they're hogs, when they are slaughtered, the slaughterhouse is carbon taxed. And the trucker that ships the hogs to the slaughterhouse is carbon taxed. And then when the final cuts of pork are packaged and put in a truck to go to our grocery store, that truck is carbon taxed. And then heating that grocery store, which is a lot of space to heat, that heat is carbon taxed as well. So by the time that piece of food gets onto your plate, it may have been carbon taxed 15 or 20 times. And you wonder why we've had the worst food inflation in 40 years after 8 years of this Prime Minister. You wonder why food is so much more expensive in Canada than it is in the United States of America. You wonder why 7 million people are skipping meals and not eating enough to remain healthy. You wonder why we have lineups around streets, around blocks, that if the images were put in grainy black and white, you would assume you were watching something out of the dirty 30s. The answer is that this Prime Minister is taxing the farmer that makes the food, the trucker that ships the food, and every other person that works hard to bring that food to our table. Common sense Conservatives have a bill that has been passed by this House that would take the tax off. The Prime Minister has deployed his carbon tax minister to pressure senators to block that bill in an undemocratic attack on the prerogative of the commoners to decide who pays what. The government cannot tax what the people do not approve, and the people do not approve of this carbon tax. They want us to axe the tax, to bring home lower prices, to bring home our food production and our self-reliance and independence to this country, to bring home more powerful paychecks, affordable food, decent homes to our Canadian people.